Ready for a deep dive that really flips how you see the world map?
I'm in if you are. Always up for a good mind-bending journey.
Perfect, because today we're hitting rewind, going all the way back to the year 1500.
1500.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we're talking about a time when the Americas were home to powerful empires, cities that were bustling.
And North America. Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly the economic powerhouse it is today.
Now that's a head-scratcher. What we have in store for our listeners today is trying to figure out why some countries that were flush back in 1500, like really rolling in it, are now facing some real struggles.
And on the flip side, places that were once considered, well, a little behind are the economic giants of today.
Right, like what happened, how the tables turned so drastically.
And to really dig into this, we'll be focusing on a fascinating body of research, one that's laser focused on former European colonies.
Ah, colonialism. Always a wild card in the game of history.
We're talking about everywhere from the heart of South America to those sun-drenched islands in the Caribbean.
Talk about a historical mystery. But before we even start, how do you actually gauge economic success from, like, 500 years ago?
Right. No stock tickers, no GDP reports. What did they use? Clay tablets and smoke signals?
You're not wrong to ask that. It's a really good question. Researchers got pretty ingenious, actually. They used urbanization, so how many people lived in cities, and population density as their go-to indicators.
Interesting. So a crowded city meant good times. Makes sense, I guess. More people, more business.
Exactly. Think about it. Only societies that had agriculture figured out and decent trade routes to get goods flowing could support big, thriving cities. More people equals more economic activity. It's a pretty reliable snapshot of prosperity, especially back when spreadsheets were still a few centuries away.
So picture it's 1500s, cities are humming in the Americas, India's Mughal empire at its peak. Fast forward to today, you'd think those same places would still be on top.
Ah, if only it were that simple. Researchers found something pretty shocking, actually a negative correlation. Basically, the areas flourishing in 1500 are often lagging behind today. It's a real head-scratcher.
Okay, so let's put on our detective hats. First suspect on the list, geography. It's gotta be geography. Maybe certain places are just blessed with the perfect conditions for building wealth, case closed. Hold on, not so fast. While geography definitely plays a role, it's not the whole story. Like, take climate, for example. There's this theory, the temperate zone takeover. It basically says that as new farming techniques came around, temperate regions had a major advantage.
Makes sense, right? Better climate, better crops, bigger harvests.
You'd think so, but the timing just doesn't line up. The real shakeup happened during the Industrial Revolution, way after those agricultural advancements. It's like finding a suspect with a rock-solid alibi.
Okay, so we can rule out climate, but what about resources? Access to coal, the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, that's got to be a factor. Seems logical, right? But here's the thing. Having tons of coal didn't automatically guarantee a one-way ticket to economic dominance. This puzzle needs us to go deeper, look beyond those obvious answers.
All right, so if it's not just where you are on the map, then what is it? What's the X factor that separates the economic winners from the, well, not winners?
This is where things get interesting. It's not about geography as much as the rules of the game institutions.
Institutions. Okay, break that down for our listeners. We're not talking about government buildings with fancy columns, are we?
Not exactly. Think of institutions like the software that makes a society's hardware actually work. They determine how power is distributed, how property rights are enforced. They're the foundation of economic life.
Got it. So the institutions are kind of like the operating system and the economy is like the app that runs on it. What kind of institutions are we talking about here?
Well, one type takes center stage private property institutions.
Okay, let's jump back in time for a second. Imagine you're a merchant in 16th century Amsterdam, a city bustling with trade. Why was that place such a success story?
It all came down to security. Those merchants, those innovators, they knew that their hard work, their businesses, their inventions were safe. They had secure property rights, meaning if they struck it rich, the government couldn't just swoop in and take it all.
So it was about trust. Trust that the system would protect their hard-earned success.
Exactly. That security, that trust, it was the rocket fuel for risk-taking and innovation on a massive scale.
Basically, the rules of the game actually encourage people to get in the game and shake things up.
Exactly. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have extractive institutions.
Now, that doesn't sound nearly as promising.
Not really. Imagine a card game, but the dealer always holds all the aces. It's rigged from the get-go.
So, extractive institutions are all about a select few stacking the deck in their favor, even if it leaves everyone else holding, well, losing hand. But if those in power knew that changing the system could mean a bigger pie for everyone, wouldn't they want to change things up?
Here's the catch about extractive institutions. They can be surprisingly sticky, resilient.
Mm.
And it's because the ones who benefit from that rigged system have zero incentive to change it. In fact, keeping things exactly as they are is in their best interest.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about colonialism's role in all of this. Because let's face it, colonizers weren't exactly known for playing by the rules. How did European colonialism shake things up?
Colonialism. It wasn't just about redrawing borders and claiming resources. It was about imposing entire systems of governance that shaped the fate of nations for centuries. It was about who set the rules of the game, and more importantly, for whose benefit.
So it's not just about who colonized whom, but the kind of institutions they brought with them, the seeds they planted that grew into the systems we see today.
You've got it. And that's where things get really, really interesting.
All right, so we've got our detector hats on, ready to untangle this historical web we've been weaving. We've ruled out geography and resources as the lone culprits behind this economic puzzle.
Right, right. It's time to put institutions under the microscope.
The rules of the game, those institutions that shape societies, and how European colonialism really shook those rules up across the globe. But the million-dollar question is, what kind of institutions did colonizers establish, and why on earth does it matter?
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to the 1500s. Imagine a map, but it's dotted with these prosperous, super densely populated regions just booming. These were the economic powerhouses of their day.
And you'd think, logically, colonizers would swoop in and be like, okay, let's build on this, let's keep the good times rolling.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But more often than not, that's not what happened at all.
Wait, what? They didn't try to, foster that existing wealth?
Not really. See, a lot of European powers back then had this get-rich-quick mentality. They were all about short-term gains and imposed extractive institutions on these already well-off regions. Long-term growth or shared prosperity, not really their jam.
So instead of investing in the bakery, they just swiped all the pastries and bolted.
That's one way to put it. Imagine these extractive institutions acting like a giant funnel, channeling all the wealth upwards. They concentrated power and resources in the hands of this tiny colonial elite.
We're talking forced labor, unfair taxes, a system designed to benefit a select few on the backs of many. So while those bustling cities in the Americas and India were once like beacons of economic success, they became ripe for exploitation under these new rules, these extractive systems.
Exactly. A classic case of short-term gain, long-term pain.
Makes you wonder what happened to regions that weren't exactly, economic powerhouses back in 1500. Places like North America, for instance.
Good point. That's where things take an interesting turn. In places like North America, where you had lots of open land and Europeans settling in larger numbers, they brought a different set of rules with them.
You mean those private property institutions we were talking about earlier? The ones that turned Amsterdam into an innovation hub?
Exactly. Those very same institutions started taking root in these colonies.
So it's like two sides of the same colonial coin. One side was all about exploiting the wealth that was already there, while the other, maybe out of necessity, was about encouraging their own people to settle and build.
You got it. And this difference, this stark contrast in approaches, would have huge consequences down the road, especially as we moved into the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution, that's a whole other kettle of fish. So we've got colonialism setting the scene, different institutions taking root in different parts of the world. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? How did the Industrial Revolution come into play and change the game entirely?
Well, imagine the Industrial Revolution as this massive wave, right?
Right.
It had the power to propel some societies forward towards crazy technological innovation and economic growth like never before.
A tidal wave of progress.
Yes. But not everyone had a surfboard to ride that wave.
So we've got this fascinating but kind of sobering picture emerging, right? This connection between colonialism, the institutions it left in its wake, and the economic trajectories of nations. But the big question, the one I'm sure our listeners are grappling with, is if institutions are the key, can they be changed? Or are we all just, I don't know, stuck with the hand history dealt us?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one without a simple yes or no answer. The past might have shaped the landscape, but it doesn't completely dictate the future.
So there's hope. We're not just, passive passengers on some predetermined route.
Exactly. Think of institutions like, the plumbing system of a society. Over time, Those pipes, they can get clogged, inefficient, even start reinforcing inequalities.
Ooh, I like that analogy. So how do we unclog those pipes? How do we create a system that's more equitable, make sure those resources are flowing where they need to go?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, no magic wand we can wave. Every society has its own story, its own unique set of challenges and opportunities when it comes to institutional reform.
So it's not a matter of finding a magic formula, but more about understanding the nuances, really getting into the nitty-gritty of how these institutions function within their specific context.
Precisely. It's about understanding the nuances, the power dynamics at play, figuring out which levers to pull to create real, meaningful change.
And where do we even begin? Our listeners are probably thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but what can I do about it? It can feel overwhelming.
It starts with awareness, honestly. Understanding how historical forces continue to shape our present and recognizing that those seemingly abstract institutions we've been talking about, they have real-world consequences for real people.
It's about connecting the dots, like between unfair trade policies and economic hardship.
Exactly. Once you see those connections, those root causes of inequality, you can start to see where you can have an impact.
Yeah.
And that's where individual action, even on a small scale, can make a difference.
So it's not about, becoming a policy expert overnight. It's about finding your own way to contribute to a more just world.
Exactly. It could be supporting organizations, fighting for economic justice, pushing for policy changes at a local level, even just having conversations with friends and family. Every action, every conversation plants a seed for change.
Because knowledge without action is, well, just knowledge.
Couldn't agree more. Institutions, at their core, are human creations.
Yeah.
And what humans create, they can change. It's a process, not a quick fix. But it starts with believing in a better, more equitable world, and then taking action, even if it seems small, because those ripples can turn into waves.
Beautifully put. This deep dive has been quite a journey, hasn't it? Through history, economics, and those complex systems that shape our world. I hope our listeners found it eye-opening, challenging, and maybe even empowering.
Me too. Remember, the learning doesn't stop here. Keep asking questions, keep challenging the status quo, and most importantly, keep believing in the power of collective action.
Couldn't said it better myself. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing and keep exploring the world around you. This is Your Name, signing off.